Um, Good morning. I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Welcome to the Wilson Center and to today's meeting on religious freedom and democratization in the Middle East, links and challenges. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Project on Middle East Democracy and the Middle East Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson and the only president with a PhD. The center was established by Congress in 1968, and it's a non-partisan institution. The center provides a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy. It maintains a neutral forum for free, open, and informed dialogue. The Wilson Center hosts around 700 meetings each year. At any given time, we are having 2 and 3 meetings going on at the same time. The Project on Middle East Democracy is a non-partisan, non-profit organization dedicated to examining the impact of American policy on political reform and democratization in the Middle East. Today's meeting will be moderated by Andrew Albertson, the Executive Director of POMED, who will introduce the speakers and chair the meeting. Andrew Albertson is the Executive Director of the Project on Middle East Democracy. Prior to that, he served as a Congressional Fellow in the office of Congressman Steve Israel and directed the membership program at the Truman National Security Project. Prior to moving to Washington, Andrew Albertson spent 2 years as a technical advisor in Guatemala in work focused on municipal governance and decentralization. While in Guatemala, he was involved in the election monitoring mission of international volunteers to observe the 2003 presidential contest. And if I understood him correctly, you just got back from Pakistan, right, monitoring the elections in Pakistan. Could I remind you, before I give the floor to Andrew, to close your cell phones, please? Yes, because it's very disruptive for cell phones to ring, and this is both for the audience and our speakers, too. Thank you. Andrew, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hala. First, I just want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting us today. This is a beautiful setting for our event. We were very excited about the large number of people that had RSVP'd for our event today, and I appreciate you guys coming out. I think, unfortunately, we lost a few to the weather. But second, I want to thank our distinguished panel of speakers. We couldn't be more excited to have you three here to speak with us about this important topic. And most of all, I want to thank you who braved the weather to come and participate in what I believe will be a very interesting and fruitful discussion. Both democracy and international religious freedom have received increasing attention from policymakers in recent years as important goals that deserve the measured, consistent support of the U.S. government. Each is a value firmly rooted in U.S. history. Each is consistent with a larger set of liberal goals that we believe have universal value. And each is sorely lacking in the Middle East, a region where U.S. support for liberal values poses special challenges. One might also argue that despite their importance, each of these goals is regularly and frequently misunderstood by the American public, with the consequence that they lack the kind of support they need. U.S. backing of religious freedom abroad is often mistaken for support for particular religions, just as U.S. democracy promotion initiatives are sometimes rightly viewed, as efforts to impose a particular set of institutions or actors on a state, rather than supporting the full freedom of individuals to choose the manner in which they are governed, the leaders who make decisions on their behalf, and the values that inform public policy. Each of our panelists today has been involved in important ways in the debate about how the U.S. should support international religious freedom, as well as the manner in which such support should intersect with other commitments to democracy and human rights. And that's the discussion we hope to advance today, with a particular focus on the Middle East. Just to raise a few questions that I think were also in some of our communications with the speakers. How do limitations on the rights of individuals to express their religious beliefs in private and public life impact U.S. interests in the Middle East? What correlations can be seen between the advance of religious freedom in the region and that of other basic rights? Are there ways that the U.S. can support both simultaneously? Are there tensions between these two goals? And what particular challenges are posed to U.S. support for religious freedom and democracy in the Middle East? I'm sure you already know our speakers, but let me introduce them nonetheless. Thomas Melia is the Deputy Executive Director at Freedom House. Previously, he was Director of Research at Georgetown's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. He's also Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where he continues to teach graduate courses about democracy promotion. For more than a dozen years, Mr. Melia has held senior posts at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, NDI, including NDI's Vice President for Programs, Director of Central and Eastern Europe Programs, and the Director of the Middle East Program. Joe Stork is Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Stork co-founded the Middle East Research and Information Project. From 1971 to 1995, he was the chief editor of its bi-monthly magazine, Middle East Report. His articles on Middle East developments have also appeared in journals and books such as The Nation, Middle East Journal, World Policy Journal, Le Monde Diplomatique, Collier's Encyclopedia, and the Oxford Companion to World Politics. He presently serves as the chair of the Middle East Studies Association's Committee on Academic Freedom and sits on the advisory committees of the American Friends Service Committee, Foreign Policy and Focus, and the Iraq Revenue Watch Project at Open Society Institute. And Thomas Farr is our last speaker. He is a visiting associate professor of religion and world affairs at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. In a long career in the Foreign Service, Farr worked on issues ranging from strategic nuclear policy to political affairs to religious freedom. During the last 4 years of his career, he served as the first director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom. Thomas taught history at the U.S. Military Academy and international relations at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and written widely on U.S. international religious freedom policy and U.S. national security. I'd also just add at the end of this bio that Dr. Farr has a piece in this next upcoming edition of Foreign Affairs, which I highly recommend to all of you. So without further ado, the format of our event is that we'll have 10 minutes for each speaker, and then we're going to leave the last 30 minutes for questions and answer. We really want this to be a discussion. So speakers, I'll try to hold you to that 10 minutes, and questioners, try to pose your question in the form of a question, if that's possible. Thank you. And Tom, you want to start?
Sure.
Okay, great.
We'll just stay here. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever you guys would prefer.
Got my materials here. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, especially on such a gloomy day. I'm amazed that so many people have actually come out on this cold, dreary day for this discussion. So thank you. It shows that there's a lot of interest in the subject, I think. And happily, we have on the panel, in various ways, ascending degrees of expertise to bring to the conversation. So I will start as the one who has more questions than answers, and then we'll go to the Middle East and religion experts who will answer them, I hope. And so I will get the ball rolling. As was mentioned, I'm now the Deputy Director of Freedom House, and we're probably best known as an organization for our annual Survey of Freedom, which comes out in a fat book and also in this thin pamphlet version. This is the edition that we just released in mid-January on the state of freedom worldwide. And we look at 25 baskets of issues each year for every country in the world. And one of them is about religious freedom. Overall in the world, this is a rather gloomy report on what happened in 2007. We discuss the decline of freedom in 38 countries, while it improved in only 10 last year. And this is the second year in a row in which we see broad declines in freedom in the world. And declines or stagnation in religious freedom is part of that story. Although it's just a part of the picture we tell in freedom in the world, it is an important part of it. And so I would urge you to look at our website, to look at the results on a country-by-country basis as you're interested in them, and to also see in our methodology how we treat the question of freedom of religion. What will probably become our best-known publication, however, is a book that we're about to publish, a 300-page book called Today's American, How Free, which will come out around the 1st of April. And this is a full-length treatise on the state of freedom in America at this point in our history. And one of the 10 major chapters in it is devoted to the question of religious freedom in America. And I think it's important to keep in mind the state of religious freedom in America as we talk about democracy promotion abroad, and in particular in the Middle East. I mean, we conclude in this forthcoming book that religious freedom in the United States is vibrant and fulsome, and maybe, in fact, unsurpassed in the world. Not because somehow it was settled immediately 225 years ago at the founding, but in fact precisely because we argue and legislate, and especially we litigate about religious freedom in this country pretty much all the time. It is central to our politics, it is central to our society, and the fact that the most religious of the established democracies is also the place where there is the most religious freedom, I think is something that is too often overlooked when we go abroad as democracy promoters, particularly American democracy promoters. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. I think we misunderstand the nature of our own democracy too often when we go abroad, and we think that we can talk about political democracy and civil liberties and civil rights in a way that is divorced from the reality of our own society, as infused with religiosity as it is. And so that's one of the major points I want to make, is that we need to be more mindful of our own story as we go abroad to talk about how democracy works and doesn't work. Now, so here's my question that I'm hoping you all will help me answer. This is a question I've been pondering for some time now, having worked at several democracy promotion organizations and traveled the world, including in the Middle East. Particularly since 9/11, we have seen an unprecedented high level of planning and programming to try to instill an appreciation for political democracy all over the world, but particularly in the broad swath of countries that extends from Morocco to Southeast Asia. Yet with some exceptions, there are some exceptions, there is an almost complete there's an almost complete absence from the discussion and the programming for democracy promotion of a vital portion of influential civil society in the Muslim world that is the object of so much attention, and that is the observant Muslim. Western, and especially U.S. government programs to engage with community leaders and intellectuals and cultural and political leaders very often tend to avoid contact with religious conservatives, and often even visibly devout men and women, out of fear that they are somehow linked to terrorists. I recall an event here in Washington just a couple years ago where at the Carnegie Endowment, a cross-section of Democratic leaders from across the Middle East was brought together for a couple of days of roundtable discussions. And there were people from our administration, an avowedly conservative political U.S. administration. And I asked one of the senior officials, one of the senior political appointees, whose name you would immediately recognize, after I'd looked around this room and been there for a couple of hours at the coffee break, I looked around and I said, I know most of these people. I've had a beer with half of them. I don't see anybody here that looks like a conservative. And I said, you're a conservative from the Bush administration. Where are the conservatives in this discussion about democracy promotion in the Middle East? And she looked at me and said, well, we can't have any contact with terrorists. I said, well, yeah, okay, let's stipulate that. Let's stipulate that we'll leave the terrorists out. Now, where are the conservatives? And she was flummoxed by this and couldn't figure out how to answer it. She thought she had already answered it. So my thesis is that this is a serious omission somehow, and potentially fatal to the cause of democracy promotion. In the semi-traditional societies of the contemporary Muslim world, virtually all of whom are struggling to overcome recent histories of autocratic governments or worse, it has to be necessary to explain democracy in terms that are compatible with a conservative social viewpoint, the popular desires in the Muslim world for traditional family values, to coin a phrase. Research on attitudes towards democracy and democratic political values across the Muslim world from North Africa through Central Asia to Southeast Asia and into the heart of the Middle East, all show that there is very similar support for all of the building blocks of democratic freedoms as we understand them in the West. It exists as well in all of the Muslim societies. People want free speech. They want to be able to associate with who they want to associate with. They want accountable government that they can change from time to time if it doesn't perform. They want to be free to do, they want to enjoy all the freedoms that we want to enjoy. There is a conflation of these freedoms with some of the particular policy or social results that are seen to occur in the West. That is, for instance, I recall doing some opinion research in Afghanistan and in Iraq at a different point in the last few years, in which, having established in focus groups and other ways with ordinary Muslims, men and women, that they shared broad appreciation for democratic freedoms, there would come a time in the conversation when people say, but we don't want that extreme kind of freedom like they have in the West, like in the United States and in Europe. And you'd say, well, what do you mean by extreme freedom? What's extreme democracy? And they would say something like, well, the licentiousness and hedonism that is so apparent in our media and in our popular culture. And this has been written about in many ways by many opinion researchers and many correspondents and researchers over the last few years especially. But there is this anxiety or fear in many parts of the Muslim world that democracy equates with this kind of progressive social program that leads to the breakdown in traditional family values, variously construed. Now, it turns out, of course, that what we know here in the United States is that this is the same complaint about American society that many Americans have, that there's too much violence and sex and skin in our media, on our TV, in our magazines, that there's too much disrespect for authority, disrespect for tradition, and disrespect for religious values. So all of the same complaints that one hears in the Middle East about the dangers of democracy occur right here in this country. And that's part of what we argue about in our elections, in our culture, and in our courtrooms, is about whether there's too much liberty in our democracy. And this political instinct for traditional family values, I think, somehow hasn't been incorporated well enough into our efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East. There are trade union organizations and political party organizations and a wide range of civil society kinds of efforts looking for peer groups in other countries to commune with, to strengthen, to strategize with. But we haven't found a way to incorporate into that the conservative religious sensibility that we share with Muslim societies. And that's my question, is how can we make the sale to the undecided Muslim in a country where the political future is somewhat up in the air? How can we persuade them that their future can be best pursued, can be best advanced, their social agenda can be best advanced in a democratic political system in which they compete for ideas and the minds and the adherence of their fellow citizens? Somehow we've been able to find a way to do that in this country, arising from a plethora of religions and conflict among religious communities. We found a way to tolerate one another in a political system that permits people to pursue a religious life in the way they want, in a way that can be done here at least as well as in any other country in the world. So this is my question, which I hope you will all help me to answer, is there something that this country, which is the most religious of the established democracies, can do to persuade religious people in other countries that a democratic system can work for them? That's my question. Our government trips over this too often because of concerns about church and state and how we can maintain a hands-off approach to religion in doing our foreign policy, in doing our aid programs, in doing our democracy promotion. And I think in so doing, our government and too many of our civil society NGOs who are engaged in this are overlooking the major audience that we need to engage in the Muslim world, among others. It's not unique to the Muslim world. It's true also in other traditional societies. You look at Orthodox cultures in Russia and Serbia, where adherence to democratic values is is tied up with other issues as well. And people's hesitation about embracing political democracy, I think, is caught up in, to some extent, with some of the same distance they see with the social outcomes of democracy in the West. To the extent that we engage with Muslims in the Middle East and beyond, I think that it often is about trying to find the right Muslim point of view, trying to find people who we can support or bolster in the internal arguments among Muslims about what the future of their culture and religious society should be. And I think that rather than trying to persuade the Muslim world that they should adopt a particular view of Islam, which I think is essentially none of our business, I think we should rather be making the case for why religion can thrive in a democracy. We should be making the case for political democracy and let the religion take care of itself. But we have to do that in a way that acknowledges that people are fundamentally religious in many cases, and certainly in the societies that we're talking about here today. So rather than try to take sides or push for winners in ideological or doctrinal debates in other societies, I hope that we can find a way to engage more fluently with religious people and talk about the role of religion in our society so that we can acknowledge a broader reality about the American democracy, and then we can be more honestly engaged with our peers and counterparts in the Muslim world. That's my thought for today.
Thank you very much. Joe, you want to go next?
Sure.
Great.
I'll add my thanks to all of you for coming, to our hosts. Clearly, freedom of belief is a core right, but with it go a number of other aspects of freedom of religion that I think we sort of have to pull apart and distinguish in order to understand what part of the problem is in the Middle East in particular. I mean, what goes with it is the freedom to practice one's religion, freedom to manifest one's belief, freedom to express one's belief. And I think here is where the problem comes in many of the Middle Eastern or predominantly Muslim societies. There aren't too many, there are a few, there aren't too many countries that actually deny the right to believe what you want to believe. The trick comes in, or the problem comes in terms of the ability, the freedom to manifest that belief in various ways, through expression, through assembly, through association. So just something to bear in mind. So we're talking not about an absence of freedom of religion, as our flyer would have it, but limitations, abridgments on that freedom. Not to minimize those abridgments, that's what I want to talk about this morning. I guess the other question I would pose, though, clearly those rights to manifest one's religion are abridged in many ways, to different degrees, in many different Middle Eastern societies. But one question I would pose, is this abridgment unique to freedom of religion? Are these restrictions any more, is denial of these rights any more, of this right of freedom of belief, freedom to manifest belief and so forth, any more of a problem than denial of other core human rights? I would say it not at all. It's part of a complex, and I think part of the problem comes in, I think, by way of trying to address sort of one of the lead questions today, the challenge for U.S. policy. I would say the challenge is what has been a politicization of religion, both in societies in the Middle East, in many cases, and in U.S. policy. In the case of U.S. policy, I think reflecting a politicization of what I would call, what Tom already referred to, sort of the unique religiosity of American society amongst the core democracies. So that the elevation of freedom of religion with the International Religious Freedom Act, for instance, the act that I think set up the office that Tom Farr headed, represented, I can say for us practitioners in the human rights movement, as well as I think for U.S. policymakers, a challenge. Now, in my view, the office in the State Department, as well as the Center for International Religious Freedom that the Religious Freedom Act set up have in fact conducted themselves extremely professionally with exhibiting a very high degree of sensitivity in terms of how they address these issues. They've been clearly looking for improvements on the ground in freedom of religion rather than sort of scoring political points. There are a few exceptions. The main one, in my view, was the failure of the Commission to release a report that they had actually written on freedom of religion in Israel and the occupied territories. But that aside, I think the problem has also been more at the policy level. The recommendations of the Commission have been, for instance, to categorize Saudi Arabia as a country of concern. I mean, I think the Commission was absolutely right on the mark in this, and it took several years of repeated recommendations before it was finally taken on board. So the problem of, or the part of the challenge, I think, is the problem of, frankly, double standards. It's a problem that plagues U.S. human rights policy generally, but it also obtains in the case of freedom of religion. It seems to me, and this may be obliquely trying to get at Tom's question, going back to the double standards and as the question was posed in the advertisement for this event, so to what extent hasty elections represent a problem. I'm not sure hasty elections are at all the problem, frankly. I would look around the region and ask, where have there been hasty elections? Or where are elections sort of on the agenda, and they're on the agenda in many, many of these societies. Where have they been on the agenda a short time? I mean, at what point does one say, hey, it's about time to actually sort of exercise the right to participate in public affairs? So I don't think the problem at all is hasty elections, but of course, what that is sort of hinting at is the problem that comes with the tensions, some of the tensions between democracy and religion, to the extent that religion, particularly universalist religions, and Islam is one of them, that have, let's put it on the table, have authoritarian aspects, authoritarian dimensions to them. So I don't think there's any lack of support amongst conservative Muslims, any more than any other sector of society in the region, for the ability to exercise freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so forth. The problem is with in part, I think, with the sort of notion of democracy as essentially majoritarian rule, and majoritarian rule that would, in a majority Muslim society, and perhaps a majority conservative Muslim society, where family values, if we want to put it that way, are very high on the agenda, and the problem comes with the imposition of these so-called family values, wherever that might lead. So I think that I think gets to the heart of some of the tension here. I think the other problem is that is with the idea of democracy, quite frankly. This is a concept that the Bush administration has adopted, not uniquely. I mean, there's a legacy here in terms of previous administrations, obviously. But democracy is not a legally defined, there isn't a legally defined standard of what democracy constitutes. What there is, though, are these core human rights that I think all of us would agree are absolutely essential to the exercise of democracy, such as freedom of speech, freedom of belief, which would include the freedom not to believe in any particular religion, freedom of association and assembly, and so forth. And it's the absence or the abridgments on these rights that are at the core of the problem. And the tension comes in the sort of question that gets raised. It was posed perhaps most acutely in the case of in Algeria in the early 1990s, when you had a political movement that very much the feast that the Islamic Salvation Front that very much took on the language, the discourse, a religiously infused ideology, if you will, and some of its leaders were very clear that, in fact, if they had their way, now whether they would have had their way is another question, which goes to the heart of the policy problem, but if they had their way, it would have indeed been one person, one vote, one time, perhaps, or at least they certainly were suggesting that, and grounding that in a particular interpretation of what Islam requires of society. I think part of another sort of aspect of the problem is to recognize that, this is a cliche, but Islam is obviously, and Muslim societies are not monolithic. And Islam, for better or worse, and I think it can go both ways depending on what problem you're talking about, and certainly this is the case with Islamic law, which most conservative Muslims say they want to see to be the law, or if not the law of the land, at least the source of legislation in their society. That you have to ask, okay, which Sharia, which Islamic law, which interpretation of Islamic law, because it's amazingly varied, and it seems to me, and I'm talking now as someone who, coming from an organization that has confronted these, we're not talking just about U.S. policy, we're talking about those of us who have been working in the human rights field in this part of the world for some time. It's very much a question that we can confront, and we have tended to, until recently at least, sort of say, we're not Islamic law scholars. We're not going to pretend to be. We're not going to set that as our agenda to acquire that expertise. Our bedrock are the international human rights standards laid down in the conventions and covenants and so forth. And it's up to states to, they freely signed on to these. They freely accepted these legal obligations. It's up to them to figure out how to fulfill it. I think that's not really, you can only get so far taking that kind of approach. And more recently, for instance, in the report that I had written on the question of religious identity and the lack of freedom of for people to identify themselves by their actual religious belief in Egypt, we had to take on issues of Sharia and interpretations of apostasy and so forth. And what you find when you do that is, in fact, you find a lot of support for positions that are very congruent with international rights standards. They may not be the majoritarian opinion, but there's certainly plenty of authoritative citations and scholars, jurists who clearly have an interpretation of what Sharia requires, and particularly not so much what Sharia requires, because after all, Sharia does govern Muslim communities, or most Muslims think it should. The question is, what's the role of the state in enforcing, or what is the obligation of the state? Is there any obligation of the state to enforce essentially religious doctrine on society as a whole, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim citizens? I sense somebody looking at me intently, like I have another minute or two.
2 minutes. How about?
Okay. So I think the problem, to get at it another way, the problem, as I said earlier, is the politicization of religion. To spell that out a little more, or to put it in slightly different terms, it's the appropriation of religion as a policy ingredient by states, many of them not all, but many of them in the region. It's the appropriation of religion and religious ideology by opposition movements. So you have those two things going on in many of the countries that we're talking about. And then you have the religiosity of society, or the conservative character of many of Muslim societies. And as I said before, the tension that represents when one's idea of democracy is essentially majoritarian, majority rules. And I think very much doesn't have, or what needs to be infused into the discussion is the whole issue of minority rights, for one, in terms of ethnic minorities, religious minorities, clearly. It also, the not just I'm not talking just about non-Muslims, but about the wide variety of religious attitudes and the differing degrees of religiosity, if you will, of Muslims in these societies. I think part of the problem I see too, and I'll close here again to sort of come back to Tom's question. I mean, to take the case of Egypt, we have a policy, I think it's frankly very wrong-headed, of we're not going to engage with the Muslim Brothers. This is not a policy that seems to me people in the embassy in Cairo are particularly happy with, but it's one they have to comply with. We have about a dozen or so senior Muslim Brother leaders who have for the last most of the past 12 months have been up before military court. Their verdict is probably coming down this coming week on the 26th. I'll be curious to see what the United States government has to say in the daily briefings or in any other forum about this, because I think up till now they've been pretty, certain individuals who are safe, politically safe in this respect, like Ayman Noor, and I'm totally endorse the support that Ayman Noor has had from the U.S. government in this regard. Not that it's helped get him out of prison, but certainly the right thing to do. But I think it also has to be. I think this is in terms of communicating seriousness about democratization and also addressing the concerns of Muslims, including conservative Muslims, would be to address movements that are clearly not terrorist, clearly do not engage in or advocate violence, but are on the outs with the particular government that is a close ally of the United States. And what we see all too often in terms of really giving content to U.S. support for freedom of religion, like U.S. support for human rights generally, is other concerns, perfectly valid concerns, national security concerns, economic interests, and so forth, in every case, or in all too many cases, trump the concern for human rights, including freedom of religion. Thanks.
Thank you. And Tom?
Well, thanks. Let me add my appreciation to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Project on Middle East Democracy for holding this panel on an issue that I think is not only very important, but one, as you will see, that I think is largely ignored by the American foreign policy establishment, even though we've had for 10 years a policy of advancing religious freedom. If I can encapsulate the questions put to the panelists into two for my purposes, the first is why the religious freedom deficit in the Middle East, and the second that I want to focus on is why should we care in terms of U.S. foreign policy. I'm going to argue that there are essentially two reasons. One is humanitarian, the other is strategic, and it's the latter that I think has been underemphasized by American foreign policy. But just a word to sort of set up my argument about the absence of religious freedom, or the dearth of religious freedom in the broader Middle East, including Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan in that. It seems to me one answer is the dearth of democracy. The Middle East, it was a region that conspicuously did not participate very much in the third wave of democratization. So one answer is that an absence of democracy means an absence of all human rights to one degree or another, and certainly religious freedom is part of that. But I think that's an insufficient answer, because if you look at those countries that are nascent democracies, particularly the Muslim countries here I'm speaking of, including Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, and arguably Pakistan to some extent, all of them are making political gains but lagging in religious freedom. Tom, Melia, and I were talking about the Freedom House rankings. The Center for Religious Freedom has a similar ranking scale for religious freedom, and almost all of those are lagging. They score higher, in other words, for civil liberties, which includes a whole group of rights that include religious freedom, but on religious freedom itself, they lag. And this is true in these Muslim countries. It's also true in Indonesia. So this leads me to the conclusion that there is a problem, mirabile dictu, with religious freedom in Islam, which of course is not saying anything very startling, although it is, I think, very startling that American foreign policy makers flee this issue like the plague, and I think Tom's story of the Bush administration, a person who feared, I noticed it was a she who said, well, we don't invite terrorists to these meetings, is very typical of the kind of attitude that I've seen for many years, and not just with the Bush administration. I've seen it in the State Department as well. It's also important to note, though, when looking at the deficit of religious freedom in the Middle East, that you do have these authoritarian regimes, both secular and theocratic, that manipulate religion and religious freedom, or the absence thereof, for their own purposes, whether we're talking about Hosni Mubarak or the House of Saud, or Turabi in Sudan, or certainly Iran. There are instrumental reasons, if you will, for the absence of religious freedom. But I think Islam is a major issue, and let me use that as a way to talk about U.S. foreign policy. We've had for 10 years now, since the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, formally, or nominally I should say, a policy of advancing religious freedom, but we really haven't done that at all. What we've done is oppose religious persecution, and the two are not precisely the same thing. We have stood with the persecuted, which is in the law, and we have looked at the humanitarian aspects of this, which of course one should not dismiss as unimportant. I would say over the course of the last 10 years, we've probably freed from harm's way, from prisons and so forth, hundreds of people, maybe even a few thousands of people. But in a world where there are literally millions of people suffering because of their religious beliefs, or being persecuted by somebody else because of their religious beliefs, to say that we have freed a few hundreds or thousands over the course of 10 years as a result of our policy strikes me as not a very vigorous policy. To me, the problem is that we are not attacking the structures of persecution. We're reacting to persecution. We denounce it. We make empty gestures of threats. The only country we've ever applied sanctions to under the International Religious Freedom Act is poor old Eritrea, which I think no one could argue has worked. It's gotten worse. We have threatened sanctions against Saudi Arabia, and I agree with Joe Stark. It was ridiculous that Saudi Arabia wasn't on the first list in 1999. It took 5 years for that to happen. Credit John Hanford for that, the current ambassador. Nevertheless, the point here is what we should be doing, in my view, is looking at what Columbia scholar Al Stepan calls the twin tolerations in advancing religious freedom. We should be looking at each country and each culture in terms of what we need to do to advance religious freedom as part of democracy. I very much agree with Tom Melia here. We should look at democracy in very religious countries as something that is not going to be consolidated unless the religion-state nexus, the religion-state relationship is not worked out. And U.S. foreign policy doesn't even think that way, much less attempt to develop policies based on this. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. In Afghanistan, of course, after the Taliban was overthrown, over the next several years, religious persecution of the terrible kind that we saw under the Taliban dramatically reduced. Persecution of women and minority Shiites and others, almost it didn't disappear, but it certainly dramatically was reduced. But this did not mean that Afghanistan had religious freedom, even though there's some weak words on the subject in their constitution. Nevertheless, today, if you talk openly about Islam, if you publish articles about Islam, if you want to investigate publicly why the Quran does not require the execution of apostates in Afghan democracy, which of course is a big issue now if you read the newspapers, you are going to be charged, whether you're a journalist or a government minister or a jurist, you're going to be charged with blasphemy under this Afghan democratic constitution. This is a religious freedom issue. When the United States, you may recall the case of the apostate Abdul Rahman back in 2006, I think it was, a man who had converted from Islam to Christianity and was discovered, and all of a sudden the world's press was focused on a courtroom in Kabul where if he was clearly guilty of apostasy, and had he been found guilty, he would have been executed, probably by beheading. U.S. religious freedom policy went to work. The president spoke publicly about it. We got Mr. Rahman freed on technicalities, whereupon he fled the country in fear of his life, and we declared a victory for U.S. religious freedom policy. Well, it wasn't a victory. It was a failure because we did not engage the issue here. And that the issue, to restate it, is that if you don't work out the balance between religion and state, which is at the core of religious freedom, in particular, so that Muslims in a society may engage publicly about their own religion and its relationship to democratic norms, then you cannot hope for a consolidation of democracy. I would also, on a second example, agree with Joe Stork. The United States is foolhardy in its policy of not engaging the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We've been talking to them for 20 years at low levels, but we're committing, in my view, the same mistake we made in Iran in the 1970s. We're going to wake up one day and people are going to be in charge of, in this case, in Egypt, arguably the most important of all the Arab Sunni countries, the seat of Sunni jurisprudence in Al-Azhar, the largest of the Arab countries, the one with, other than Lebanon, the most religious pluralism, or plurality, I should say, with the Coptic Christian minority. We're going to wake up one day and the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be in charge. We're not going to understand their language, much less their goals. And it's true, the Mubarak regime tells us that they will abrogate the Camp David Accords, they'll declare war on Israel, they'll try to restore a caliphate. This all may be true, and I'm not proposing that we assume they are liberals aborning, but that we do not know what they are, and ignorance is not a good basis for foreign policy in a world of religion. Why do we do this? Why do we, the U.S. government, the U.S. foreign policy establishment, refuse to put religion on the policy table, just as we do economics or politics or strategic military policy? I think there are a whole host of explanations from across the range of American culture and politics, ideology, from the left's aversion to religion in the public square to the right's aversion to Islam in the public square. If you look at the major schools of foreign policy, classical realism, liberal internationalism, even neoconservatism, all of them for very different reasons take religion off the policy table. This was no doubt at Neocon that was speaking to Tom Melia at this Bush administration gathering of Middle Eastern experts. She did not want to put religion on the policy table, and it could have been a liberal internationalist from the Clinton administration talking as well. There is a convergence of views on this, undergirded by this vague sense that engaging religious communities abroad is somehow unconstitutional, that the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, means that we must remain ignorant with respect to the religions of the people of the world in a time when religion is resurging all over the world and has unarguably had an enormous impact already on our national security. And I'm not speaking here only of Islam. What I'm saying, I think, is true of China, it's true of Russia, it's true of India and elsewhere. I would also add that our democracy dollars have by and large tried to avoid engagement with the fundamental drivers of culture in much of the world, and that is the religious communities. Since the early 1980s, the National Endowment for Democracy, the NDI, the IRI, the USAID, the State Department's Human Rights and Democracy Fund, with a few honorable and important exceptions, have tried to avoid, or have felt they must avoid, spending money that engages foreign religious communities. And so we build democracy and we build civil society as if religion was not the major driver of culture in much of the world. It's foolhardy and it needs to stop for our own interests in the world, which is my major message to you today. If you want to read more about that, you can certainly read the CSIS study, which came out within the last several months, entitled Mixed Blessings. The CSIS is, somebody help me here, the Center for, or the Strategic International Studies. And this is an excellent study that basically says what I've just said and says it better. What can we do about this? I think what we can do is actually promote religious freedom, as we think we've been doing or some of us think we've been doing for the last 10 years, rather than cursing the darkness, responding to persecution in essentially a fruitless way. And there are exceptions to that sweeping generalization I just made, but those exceptions are the ones that tend to prove the rule. And here I will just end by my answer to Tom Melia's excellent question: how can we make the sale to undecided Muslims that democracy will advance their values? I think that's precisely the right question to ask, and the answer is that religious freedom, there's data out there. I mean, it's common sense in one sense. Even though religious freedom can be problematic in highly religious societies, there's a growing amount of data among social scientists who don't have an axe to grind that religious freedom, the absence of it, is associated with instability, conflict, and war, but its presence is associated with things you wouldn't associate with religion necessarily, and that is high female literacy, lower infant mortality, higher economic development. Here's sort of the Weber thesis intruding on my comments. And here's the real answer to the question: the consolidation of democracy. No Muslim democracy, or no democracy, in my opinion, in any of the countries of the world that have major religious communities, is ever going to be stable and lasting unless the religion-state nexus is not worked out, and not in the way that we want it, but in a way that is culturally sustainable in the countries that are the objects of our foreign policy.
Thank you very much to each of our speakers. Now we'll just turn it over for questions. I think we have some microphones that we'll be passing around. If I could, I just want to interject a few other thank yous that I forgot in the beginning. Joyce Ibrahim is in the back, and she's largely responsible for this event. And also Azucena Rodriguez, the Middle East Program Assistant here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'll also acknowledge David DeBartolo, who directs POMED's dialogue programs, including our events around D.C. So thank you to all of you for doing the real work for setting this event up. And now, questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all to thank panelists, and it's very pleasant. I think good presentation in panelists when there are questions and food for thoughts and allow to think deeply about it. So I really appreciate it. My name is Chingiz Mammadov. I'm fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. At the same time, I'm from Azerbaijan, and I think that somehow I will try to present my point of view. Maybe it will be helpful for the audience as well. I think going back to Thomas Melia's excellent question, I would even make it broader. And the major problem is that in Muslim societies, there is widely shared belief, and I am touching what I know for sure, that the West does not want democracy in Muslim countries. Widely shared belief, believe me. And now I would like to elaborate what are the reasons for that. Is it groundless, or there are some grounds? And if there are grounds, so what's the way to eliminate this? First, of course, very obvious, the legacy of imperialism. We cannot deny that, because for centuries and decades, imperialism was there. And Muslim countries, including Azerbaijan and neighboring countries, have misbelieved that current policy is continuation of the previous policy. Second, activities of multinationals, you cannot deny that they are looking for benefits, and in most cases it's at the expense of countries that they are operating. Third are double standards, and let me speak about issues that I know most. For example, Azerbaijan is a country about 16-17% of territory is occupied. 1 million refugees. At the same time, United States and the West is punishing Azerbaijan for not supplying Armenia with goods and things. Let me finish. I know that democracy is important and we have to obey rules. But as a person who watched debates, during last several months, I think that when candidates are speaking about substantial issues, they are allowed to speak. So allow me finish. So unless double standards are eliminated in issues like that, all attempts to promote democracy in Muslim countries will be unsuccessful, because not only authoritative governments, but even representatives of civil society and public at large has some suspicious. And all attempts, all money is poured, all people are coming, are kind of useless. And it has also a second aspect. We are talking about democracy, it's a good idea, but let's look to policies. People are coming to Azerbaijan as representatives of United States and Western organizations. And I worked for several organizations which names were mentioned here and who you are affiliated with. For example, in Georgia,
if you could,
I will
you
finish.
need to wrap it up so we can just
Yes, I
answer
will finish.
also.
To the 2002, 2003, in Georgia, most of international and U.S. organizations were represented already by local people, Georgians. In Azerbaijan, despite 15 years of independence and people who graduated from the United States universities, from Europe, they are working, and in Azerbaijan, you can count by fingers of one hand local branches of international organizations which are kind of managed by local people. So this is another. They don't have opportunities to grow within society, within official state, but they don't have opportunity also to grow within international. Let me finish.
Thank you. We just want to get to some other questions. I'm sorry. So let me, if we could finish there, and then would anyone like to respond to those?
Give me 15 seconds.
No, if we could move on. Thank you very much, though. Would anyone like to respond to that? Okay. Maybe we'll move on to the next. And I just want to congratulate our speakers on their great adherence to our time limits. If the questioners could also adhere to the criteria that I'd asked also. Yes, please, in the front.
Chris Schaefer, thanks for the fabulous presentations. I felt a little bit, I wonder if you could give a few more examples of what U.S. policy could be doing. You mentioned engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood is one thing I heard. You mentioned not meddling in doctrinal discussions, if I understood you correctly. But I felt at the end, I just didn't know what we should actually be doing programmatically to bring about attention to religious freedom. Thanks.
Well, I would spend money. I would remove all barriers from the national democracy, NED, USAID, and State Department for programmatic approaches to religious groups. This doesn't mean we have to be stupid. It means that we need to be wise and discerning. But right now, we're just sort of avoiding these groups. Now, there's a prudential point to be made here. Nobody in the U.S. government wants to be responsible for granting money to a group that's going to use it for terrorist purposes. There's a risk here, but we can't be so risk-averse that we don't spend our democracy money on the most culture-forming aspects of the societies that we're engaged in. So I think that's point one. Point two is I think we need to shift the approach of the International Religious Freedom Office from its essentially negative, responsive approach to persecution to a proactive involvement. I'll give you just a brief example of how this works within the State Department. The Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, who's a wonderful man and does great work, and my comments are not about him but about the position, it's a minor position. It's a mid-level position, even though under the law it's the principal advisor to the President and the Secretary of State. When there are policy meetings of senior people on Iraq or China or pick your subject, even on engaging Islam, this ambassador in this office is not considered relevant to the issue. Why not? Because if the bishop's about to get his head cut off, then you've got to go to that office. But if we're talking about our policy, it's not relevant. This gives you a sense of the compartmentalization of this issue that in my view has plagued it. So that's a couple of answers to your question.
Could I just add to that? I mean, I think in terms of Tom's first recommendation, I completely agree. But I think the issue is more than one of inadvertently providing funding or having any kind of association with a group that is advocates violence. That it goes beyond that. I mean, the fact is that any discussion of the Middle East in this country today is plagued, in my view, with there's an atmosphere of intolerance. The issue, a lot of that intolerance comes from people who see themselves as supporters of Israel. So that any kind of discussion with Muslim groups, the fact is that many Muslims in the world and many Muslims in the Middle East and many Muslim organizations, political organizations that are not at all terrorist in any way, shape, or form, happen to have strong views on the Israel-Palestine question. So that we have to be prepared, if we follow Tom's prescription, and I think we should, for the heat that's going to come in terms of media attacks and so forth. And so the administration, whichever administration it might be that implements this, has to be prepared to go to the mat on these issues and sort of stand up for an intelligent policy.
I have two thoughts on that, and I'm glad you posed it early because I think it's sort of the heart of today's discussion. One is building on what's been said here. In political development programs that I've been familiar with at NDI and generally in the AID, NED families, I think one of the things we learned in the last decade was that we need to be trying to enable new Democrats in potential democracies to become literate not only in political process questions, but ultimately in economic literacy questions. We don't have to promote a particular economic model to say that if you want to be a member of parliament or president of a country, you should know something about supply and demand and public policy and finance and fiscal matters. And that's beginning to happen in some of the political development programs that Americans are engaging in around the world. I think there needs now to also be added to that the notion that we need to focus on religious literacy. You know, we need people to be able to walk and talk and be familiar with religious issues in the way that Tom Farr was talking about. We need that for our diplomats. We need that for our NGOs. And they tend to be, not universally, but predominantly kind of liberal, secular internationalists for whom religious issues traditionally are not spoken about. And I think we need to find a way to become more comfortable about that. And I think one way to get there is the second observation I would make is we need to know more about the story of religious freedom in the United States. And I don't think enough of us know that story. Where it came from, how we got where we are today. It's really an interesting story. And democracy promoters are blissfully unaware of it, I would say. So we need to sort of somehow persuade all of our major democracy organizations in and out of government to learn about our own history. There are many ways in which the American model is completely useless and inappropriate when we travel around the world. Our election system, for instance, should not be talked about outside of these borders. But there are things that we should be proud of. And I think the story of religious freedom in the United States is one of them. And we need to find a way to incorporate that into our discourse.
Could I just add briefly my endorsement of what Tom just said, particularly about the American religious freedom story? I think the story recounted by most diplomats today, or one that they've absorbed, is that the founders privatized religion. They knew it was such trouble. They came from a continent where we had had the wars of religion, and so the purpose of the First Amendment was to make sure that religion did not cause problems in the American political system. Well, this is precisely, exquisitely wrong. It is precisely the other way around. The founders wanted to tame religion in the sense that they wanted to bound it, but they wanted to invite it into the public square, which is the purpose of the First Amendment. And I agree with Tom that we have a vigorous, if not perfect, system of religious liberty as a result. But you can't sell this. Our diplomats can't sell it if they don't understand it, so I agree.
Okay, we have a number of questions, so maybe we can combine two or three at a time. Okay, yeah, right here. No, in the jean jacket. Oh, yeah.
Thank you all for giving us lots of food for thought here. My question is for anyone who wants to answer. It came to mind while Joe was speaking, but if any of the panelists want to address it. I think he rightly pointed out that the question here, I agree with the general consensus that seems to be emerging that we need to broaden the circle of who we're engaging and who we're talking to include more voices from conservative religious backgrounds. But the larger question comes down to the obligation of the state. And when we get to the nitty-gritty questions of institutional protections of religious freedom, not only do we run into the challenge of advocating that these protections be instituted and therefore seeming to take sides with a religious minority in a state, but we also run into the danger of basically further atomizing society along religious lines and further enforcing this as a mechanism of identification. My question is, what do we do about that? And I was surprised that the example, a salient example, but maybe sort of a unique one, but still relevant, the example of Lebanon didn't come up, where you have one of the more liberal, sort of modern democratic systems in the region, and clearly a big problem with sectarian identification.
Thank you very much. Stanley and then Michael.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. My question really follows up on that one. Mr. Stork referred to the politicization of religion. Why should that be surprising? The 20th century is the century of the collapse of empires. First World War, Second World War, end of Cold War. A lot more countries now than there were back then. This is similar to European history. When the Holy Roman Empire broke up, new countries emerged. The new states had to be defined. How are they defined? In terms of religion. What was the consequence? Decades of religious war. Which brings me to this question of Lebanon. It was a democracy. There was religious freedom. It had a civil war. It looks as if it's on the brink of civil war again. Is that the historical period that we have entered?
And then Michael, if you...
Michael Allen, National Endowment for Democracy. First, a clarification.
I'm not sure. Is everyone hearing the mic?
I think it's on. Sounds
okay,
like it's
sorry,
on.
go ahead.
Yeah, just a clarification leading to a question. It may be the case historically, I think, that democracy promotion groups have not engaged with the religious communities in the Middle East. I certainly think it's a misconception to say that's the case today. The NED, for example, we fund networks of Muslim Democrats in the region, which incorporate moderate Islamists. We'll come to questions of definition later. And I think it's also the case that our institutes also work with moderate Islamists across the region, from the PJD in Morocco through Yemen and Bahrain and elsewhere. However, I must say that this raises the question of engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Brotherhood in Egypt is a different kettle of fish, to coin a cliche. The Islamists that we have engaged with, and I'm talking about the democracy community in general, the democracy promotion community in general, have shown a commitment to democracy, to pluralism, to religious tolerance. Frankly, one cannot say that unequivocally about the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a grey, well, it's more than a grey area. I know that one of our institutes approached the Muslim Brotherhood for a form of engagement not so long ago. Their riposte included an anti-Semitic slur referring to Madeleine Albright's Jewish origins. We saw recently the Muslim Brotherhood's draft platform explicitly states that no woman and no Copt can occupy the presidency or any other chief office in Egypt. Even the so-called reformists within the Brotherhood, like Futter, are at best ambivalent about Coptic rights. One of these reformists interviewed recently, when asked if Copts could build churches under a Brotherhood regime, responded, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, saying, "I think we've got enough Christian churches in Egypt." My question is really, non-violence is not a sufficient criterion for engagement. What are the appropriate criteria for determining how and in what ways one engages with Islamists in the region?
Okay, thank you very much. If each of our panelists could respond to those tough challenges, the Muslim Brotherhood in Lebanon. Tom,
Well,
Joe, do you want to
since
go
I brought it up, why don't I go first? My point was really not the one that perhaps you heard. I mean, suggesting engagement does not mean endorsement, first of all. And I think it's precisely one of the merits of engagement is that it enables you to sort of have dialogues with different currents within that particular organization or any other organization like it. My point actually was, and perhaps I didn't express it clearly enough, was with reference to the military trials and the upcoming verdict. You know, this is a travesty to put. Whatever one thinks about the liberalness or lack of liberality or tolerance on the part of Muslim brothers as a whole, these are not people who should be brought up before military trials. So that was really all I was intending to suggest, rather than any kind of endorsement that, hey, these guys are Democrats, why aren't we, working with them?
I would agree with Michael Allen in a slightly different way, that I think there's a range of values that should matter to us. Nonviolence seems to me to be sort of the low bar. And then there's a whole series of other questions about who we engage with in the world, whether as political parties or governments or social groups. And I think that's right. And I think discussions of electoral democracy sometimes lose sight of that. That, having clean elections in which the process is clean and the votes are counted accurately, something we aspire to in this country, I think should be a de minimis kind of reference point. Then it matters sort of what people stand for. What are they going to do in government? What do they stand for as political movements, as individuals, as candidates, as organizations? And so the whole range of things that Michael talks about, I think, are very important for everything else we do. And just on that, I want to loop back to a comment that Joe made earlier in his initial presentation, which was about what I would, in a friendly demurral, would say is a false dichotomy between discussions about political democracy and rights. And I think that you're right to focus on the series of rights as embodied in universal UN and other conventions, and the rights as they apply to individuals for religion, association, speech, etc. But I think that, again, if we only focus, it's sort of a de minimis reference point in the same way that just focusing on nonviolence is a low bar. What we're looking for is a broad, it's only in a political democracy that rights are really guaranteed. In a non-democracy, any enjoyment of rights that the individual has is conditional because it can be taken away from you. And so I think that rights are important, but they can only really be guaranteed in a democratic political framework. And so I think it's a false dichotomy to say that, well, the Bush administration is for democracy and we're really for human rights. I think that's an unhelpful way to look at it. I think we have to really integrate these ideas rather than try to tease them apart, because they're really parts of a whole. And so back to what Michael said, I agree. Values and what people stand for, if and when they get elected, I think is something we should always be focused on.
I would just add that, first on Lebanon, that I'm not sure it's accurate to say that Lebanon at one point had religious freedom. What it had at one time was a sort of balkanization that was stable among the various religious communities, which is not the same thing as religious freedom. We may well be entering into a period of religious war in the broader Middle East. It may be a Sunni-Shia war. Let's hope that is not the case. It seems to me that religious freedom provides one kind of obstacle to that kind of a broader religious conflict, and that we should be in there battling in a way that we are not, to make the case to these people that there's a cost-benefit analysis that you're not looking at, and even though we're not going to tell you how to do it, you can take a look at our experience now, which might be helpful in that regard, historical experience. On the issue of NED funding networks of Muslim Democrats, and the gentleman used the term Islamists as well, I would be very, very interested in knowing more about this. Perhaps I'm completely wrong, and if so, I will acknowledge it. But my impression is that the Muslim Democrats that we have been funding and engaging do not fall into the category of the kind of conservatives, to use Tom Melia's word, that tend to be the drivers of culture. But please, I would like more information on that. I would say that on the Muslim Brotherhood, to me, a very important question is, can we influence the evolution of these people? To me, they're like the fiddler on the roof. They could go either way. And we're kind of standing, with our eyes closed, saying, we sure do hope Hosni Mubarak can work this out for us. I think that's foolish. I think we need to have a very discerning policy about how to engage them, but not the current policy, which is not to engage them.
Great. More questions? Yes, please.
I wanted to ask if you could address the issue of the tension between religious freedom and women's rights, because the issue of traditional family values, both in the U.S. and the Middle East, often is about the role of women in society. So while you would want to support religious freedom in Turkey, allowing women to wear the hijab, we would be concerned about the prosecution of rape victims in Saudi Arabia. So if you could address that.
Mm-hmm. And then right behind her. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Eleonora Silprandi, and I am from the Southeast Europe project here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So I would like to specify that I come from a legal perspective and from a European perspective, which changes a little bit the scenario. So my point is that I have the feeling, and I'm asking you, that today democracy is equal to discourse of rights. This you mentioned a little bit, the dichotomy between the concept of democracy and the concept of rights. I believe that there is a lack of coherence that is very problematic in this. Like, we want on one side to recognize rights. On the other side, we should remember that the strength of democracy comes from the fact that it's a coherent system of norms. And there are some principles. One of these principles is the responsibility of the individual. And this is a very problematic issue when it comes to religious groups. So, and the other question, and I'm done, is for Mr. Stork. Don't you think that going case by case when it comes, for example, to Sharia law, or whenever it comes to recognizing a right, could create a sort of a state of exception that also in this case wouldn't be coherent with the rest? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I think, sir, here, if you can.
Hello, thank you for being with us. I would like to address two issues on that topic. The first one would be on democracy. How can you expect the people in the Middle East to adopt democracy when a large percentage of the people don't know what democracy is or have a wrong image of democracy from what they see on TV? That's one. On religious freedom and democracy, how can you ask people to adopt democracy when there's no religious freedom? Take the case of Iraq, the Assyrians being persecuted. What about the Copts and the rights of the Copts in Egypt? Or the Christians in Palestine? What about the Kurds? Talking about religion and cultures. So what about, how can you expect from people to want democracy when obviously there's no democracy?
Good. I think we gotta, that should be the max.
Just one more. On the case of Lebanon.
If we could get to the speakers and if you can respond to those. Thank you very much, though.
Could I just add, just on the case of Lebanon, there's a big misconception. It wasn't a religious war. The civil war wasn't a religious war. It was a geopolitical war for definitely regional and international interests. That's my opinion. I have.
Thank you.
Okay, the question of women's rights. I mean, this is one of the things I could have specified. I didn't, but it's certainly one of the areas I had in mind when I talked about the tension between the majoritarian view of what democracy, majoritarian interpretation, if you will, of what democracy entails, and the tension between some of the authoritarian characteristics of religious communities. There's a real tension here. On the one hand, I think one can talk about, kind of the movement for human rights, and I would include in that, the democratic freedoms, certainly, has grounding in religion, but it also faces challenges from religion at the same time. And I think that there's no easy, quick answer to that. I think it does have to get, and obviously it's those societies that are going to have to work that out. I think we do have to we can help by sort of making clear what the boundaries are, what the markers are or should be, and engaging with, but certainly it's women in these societies that are not only women, but women in the forefront, I think, in these societies who are and will continue to sort of lead those struggles.
I think it's a good question. The women's rights and religious freedom do frequently collide, not just in Islam, but in other cultures as well, in Christianity and Judaism. There are interpretations of those faiths that equally can be understood to restrict women's rights. And I think this is where what I heard Joe saying about the majoritarian instincts of religious communities is, I think, the danger here. And it comes down to the individual. Does the individual have the right to live his or her life in freedom, to make choices and accept responsibilities that they want to do? Just as the measure of a political process, a political system, is whether the individual voter, alone in the ballot booth by themselves, are they free to make a choice for who shall govern them? Have they had all the information they need? Have they been able to ask the questions they want? Have they been able to associate with whoever they want in the process of the election? And is that honestly independent, informed choice going to be reflected in the outcome of the elections? That's ultimately the measure of a political system. Is the individual able to make a free, informed choice that will have consequences? And the same applies in the religious sphere, it seems to me. Ultimately, the question is the individual really free to make a choice? And if the individual is infringed upon for making a choice by a community that does not allow her to make a real choice, and that restricts her options, then it's not a free society. It's not even freedom of religion to the extent that people are obliged or suborned to be part of it. If free will is not part of religious adherence, then it doesn't count. Then it is just pressure or subordination. So I think, and in all of the cultures of the world that have developed what we would consider a modern appropriate sensibility for women's rights, they've all had to work through religiously informed resistance to women's rights. That's as true in Europe and America and Israel as it is anywhere else in the world. But again, I think a democratic foundation enables that process to take place. The temptation in some places is the Tunisian temptation to say, well, if we have the right kind of dictatorship, we can have women's rights. Well, again, that's all conditional. Those women have the right to wear a skirt and go to work and wear their hair however they want, but they don't have the right to choose their government, to read a newspaper. There's a lot of rights they don't have. So women's rights in Tunisia are conditional and constrained, and so I think that they will have fuller rights in a more democratic Tunisia, and that's what I think we have to figure out how to work towards ultimately. But yeah, it has to be an engagement with the religious sensibility to inform them about how and why women's rights can be consonant with their religious tradition. It happens in Islam as it happens in other major faiths, but I think to try to shortcut that process, the dictatorship of women's rights, Tunisian style, I think is a false hope.
Great. And with apologies to those who didn't get to ask their last questions, we'll have to make these the final words. Dr. Farr.
Oh, my goodness. Well, there's much to be said, but let me just boil it down. I agree basically with what Joe and Thomas said on the issue of the balancing of the rights of a religious community, which after all has rights within religious freedom, and the rights of the individual. I think what we're talking about here, properly understood, is an immunity in civil society. That is to say, individuals cannot be restricted by governments from leaving a religion or joining another religion or having no religion at all. However, the religious community retains rights to make its truth claims about women, make its truth claims about men and the individual. And there's definitely a tension here. Of course, the most extreme version of the tension is in Saudi Arabia, which I think was cited here. But the answer to this, it seems to me, is twofold. One, to do a better job of allowing these conservative communities to understand the benefits to themselves, not just to some abstract notion of democracy, but to their religious communities, to opening up on this. I mean, there's plenty of data on this to show how they will flourish. And of course, this means that they have got to understand this not because some democracy promotion program from the United States says it, but because it comes from the heart of their own religious truth claims. And they are there in Islam. They are there in most of the religious world religions. But to say that we as American foreign policy makers don't think about that is to vastly understate the question.
Well, thank you all for coming. I think it was a very interesting discussion. And thank you again to our speakers, to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Middle East Program.